The orchestra is going to start out, and you come in, and you want to play that, with your arms, with your back.
That's tonebase artist John Kimura Parker performing Rachmaninoff's Rhapsody on a Theme of Paganini with the Shepherd School Symphony Orchestra at Rice University, my alma mater. Go Elves! More from Jackie Parker in a moment, but first, Garrick, could you play the original theme this piece is based on?
And so on.
Thanks, G. Rachmaninoff's Paganini Rhapsody is best known for its romantic 18th variation, which captured the imagination of Hollywood, and for my generation, that meant Groundhog Day, starring Bill Murray.
Not bad, Mr. Connors. You say this is your first lesson?
Yes, but my father was a piano mover, so.
Once Phil Connors masters the piano, he shows off his chops with a jazzified arrangement of the 18th variation transposed up a step. Appropriate given the jazz elements in the piece. But the 18th variation is actually not the best example of Rachmaninoff's American influences. In fact, after his friend Vladimir Horowitz pointed out that this variation sounded like the old Rachmaninoff, Sergei responded, only half-jokingly, that he wrote it for his manager. Although based on Paganini and the ancient Dies Irae, this piece lives in a modern sound world, from Hollywood to the hustle and bustle of New York. Similar to Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue, or even more, his lesser-known Rhapsody in Rivets, originally titled Manhattan Rhapsody.
The Rhapsody on the Theme of Paganini sounds like it's a piece written in the 30s. It's a bit film noir, and it's not exactly jazzy, but you could tell he was living in the modern world when he wrote it.
It's a very urban-sounding work. Although Rachmaninoff composed it in the Swiss countryside at his summer villa in 1934, it's evident he's dreaming of New York here. This is the gritty 9th variation, which, as Garrick said, you can hear Manhattan of the 1930s in it. There is one variation, however, that reveals some of Rachmaninoff's more direct jazz influences, and that is the fleet-fingered 15th variation. More on that in a moment, but first, did I mention it's Rachmaninoff's 150th birthday this year? And what better way to celebrate than by binge-watching in-depth courses on the Paganini Rhapsody with Jackie Parker and the formidable Third Concerto with Garrick Olson. Check them out on the Tonebase Premium platform. Enter Art Tatum. Rachmaninoff was one of many classical musicians of his era who heard Tatum perform, including Horowitz and the conductor Leopold Stokowski. Rachmaninoff reportedly said about Tatum, "If this man decided to play classical music, we're all in trouble." Classical pianists can't do that. We can, however, pretend by trying to learn Rachmaninoff's 15th variation. For help on that, back to Jackie.
Okay, so now we're at variation 15. This one's famous, rightfully so, for being very difficult to pull off. Easy to get tripped up, for sure. In case you're wondering where the inspiration for this came from, certainly one active theory that makes perfect sense to me. We know that Rachmaninoff loved jazz. We know that he would go up to Harlem and go to jazz clubs and listen all the time, particularly to Art Tatum and Fats Waller. And if you think of Art Tatum and you think of the kind of way that he played, it kind of makes sense from that light finger technique to have something like this. This variation is all about fast fingerwork, but it's also about musical phrasing. So if you remember, and that coming from, which comes from this, it's all tied together. We now have, and then again. And it's all related, and you can hear it all relates back to that theme. The difficulty here is that it's constant running 16th notes. I remember the very first time that I learned this piece. It was sometime in the mid-'80s. I was about to go and perform it with the Winnipeg Symphony, my first time ever playing it. And I reserved time in the Steinway basement. It was the old basement on 57th Street where I could go in there sometimes for a couple hours. And there would be all these pianos around. It was a fantastic place to be. And I went down there with my friend Norman Krieger. And Norman was playing through the accompaniment and I was playing the solo part. And we got to this variation. And I said, so how did that one sound? And he said, well, it was too fast. And I said, how could it be too fast? It's like fast-moving 16th notes. And he says, yeah, but where's the phrasing? And I was so caught up in the idea that it's marked più vivo and it's got a scherzando marking. And I started to think, well, the whole point of this is that it's really, really fast. Well, yes, it does go fairly quickly, but you need to hear all that phrasing in there. You need to hear, and then this has to be parenthetical. And this as a kind of a reaction. And that kind of saying your main argument again. And this as another reaction. And then opening up and reacting. And opening up slightly less because it's one note shorter that you, and reacting. Then we have a pattern. Then we have an actual official hemiola pattern. That's very clear, 2, 2, 2 in the middle of 3, 4. Then we land on a nice open C, and then it goes sort of crazy with this chromatic pattern. And another one, which, by the way, the only way I can play that is to really rotate my wrist. Just like that, just a little bit all the way down. It just helps put my fingers in the right place at the right time. Then we're back. Then we have a really interesting variation in the accompaniment figure, which is different from all the other ones. This goes higher. And then we have not just another hemiola, but usually the point at which the conductor starts beating for the orchestra. Up until this point, the conductor's just kind of waiting for you to play all this stuff. The orchestra doesn't need to know. All the orchestra needs to know is the conductor always starts conducting 4 before rehearsal 40. I've heard 4 before 40 so many times it's kind of burned into my head that that's where it is. And it's a hemiola bar. Now, right at that point, the orchestra comes in, and you can no longer be quite as free interpretively as you were earlier. You can do a little, but you have to be cognizant of the fact that the orchestra is now playing. So everything that you've done earlier, where you're really having fun, things like that, and you're just making little colors and all of that, suddenly at this point, at that point, you're going to want to be fairly strict with what's happening because the orchestra comes in here and they're coming in with eighth notes and they're coming in very lightly. And all you want to know is that the cello, you really want to hear that. By the way, a really great thing to do when you're practicing a concerto is to take a section of the solo part that you've learned and record it. And then play that recording back with headphones, preferably ones that go over your head, actually, so that you can remove the earpiece halfway across one ear so you can also hear yourself, but you're still hearing that. And then play the accompaniment along to the recording you've just made. And first of all, you'll get to know the accompaniment, which is kind of important, because sometimes accompaniments have totally different musical figures in them than what we're playing. You'll also get a very clear idea of how good your playing is in terms of being easy to follow. And that can be useful to know. I mean, sometimes you'll change what you're doing so that it's easier to follow. Other times you'll say, no, I really want to do it that way, so I'm going to ask the conductor, please give me extra time on the third beat of that bar, whatever it is, you know. So at this point, you're just listening to the cello and just hearing what's happening. I've also noticed that there's a lot of very closed hand kind of technique that you need more in the first couple pages of this variation, you know, where you're doing this. I mean, that all takes place in one little area. And most of the time my hand is open to a sixth or a seventh. And then when you get into, when the orchestra comes in, there's passages like this. And suddenly you're having to move around a lot, you know, and you're covering a several octave span. So psychologically, it's kind of helpful for me to think a little bit in terms of a little closed, and then once the orchestra comes in, to just open that up and have a kind of an organic arm motion to get through a lot of this. There are great moments, and again, always to think of how can I follow the phrasing of this whole thing so it just doesn't sound like a collection of 16th notes. And for example, and then we have color. You can do a little bit of that. There's a couple of bars there where the orchestra stops playing, so you have a tiny bit more freedom to take some time. Then the orchestra's back in, and then you're going to have to be a little bit more rhythmic. But as you're playing this, just be aware that what they have a little echo of what we heard several variations ago when I was talking about Hollywood and the Horses. They have bum 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 ba while you're doing. So you want to be really aware of all of that so that you're phrasing with them and the whole thing takes on a kind of a musical purpose. There's a question at the very end of this, which is how to time this. It should be a crescendo. I find it's kind of impossible to play exactly in time. It's just a kind of a panic. So everyone expects there'll be a little extra time on that beat. So you have, and then, so all that's happening in the orchestra there is that the horns are holding a chord, they're crescendoing while you're going up. And then when you play this, they have a little sort of sforzando at the end of the note. It's not quite an extra note though. So generally a conductor will have an idea of what your timing is and they'll cue that. But I've always found that if it isn't perfectly together, it doesn't matter too much. You've got the pedal down and you're just doing a big swoop. And just take your time. And then finally,